Hello and welcome to the primary school staff CPD training on self-harm in younger children. My name is Liz Beckingham. I'm a trainee clinical psychologist. I've been on placement all year in the psychology team supervised by Dr. David McKee, and I'm joined by Lauren Colohan, an assistant psychologist, and you'll be seeing something of her later. When it comes to talking about self-harm, it really is true that language matters. And I just wanted to draw your attention to the fact that a common term that we hear around self-harm is the notion of deliberate self-harm. And the other way that it's sometimes described in sort of the official literature on the subject is non-suicidal self-injury. If we look to definitions that are out there about self-harm, there is talk in the dictionary of the act of deliberately causing harm to oneself, either by causing physical injury, putting oneself in dangerous situations, and or self-neglect. And the NICE definition of self-harm talks about intentional self-poisoning or injury. And what we see with these terms is that there is a kind of willfulness that's implied, as if the child or young person who is engaging in self-harm is deliberately and consciously setting out to do something. And I'd like to really question that term, deliberate self-harm. The young people who do engage in self-harm tell us that they object to this terminology. Quite often self-harm occurs in a kind of dissociative state where young people aren't aware of almost what they're doing. And they can feel quite numb at that moment, probably quite out of control. So to imply that it's deliberate is really not a great way of starting out talking about self-harm with young people. We also advise against using the term self-harmer. That term, again, is really giving someone an identity that focuses only on the behaviour, and it just doesn't feel helpful that young people are described in that way when it misses out so much more about who they are as little people. I'm going to, first of all, talk through a lot of the myths that are out there about self-harm. This feels really important because there really are a lot of misunderstandings about what self-harm is and how it comes about. So the first one that I'm going to start with is it's just a phase and children will grow out of it. Well, that's a lovely idea, and it is true that for some young people it's something that can sort of dissipate with age as they learn to better manage or alternately use different strategies to manage the problems that they've been facing. But let's be really clear, there are plenty of adults who also engage in self-harm because their psychological distress is such that they need to find a way to cope, and that's the coping strategy that they use when things get really bad. So we have to be really clear in schools that thinking that it's just a passing phase and that it's just going to go away of its own accord is not the most helpful way that we can support our young people. Far better to understand why they're doing it and what's going on for them and how can they be supported in the difficulties that they face. The second myth that I want to kind of debunk on this training is that people self-harm to get attention or to manipulate others. There is a big narrative in this country about self-harming being attention-seeking and a cry for help. And actually what we know is that an awful lot of people who self-harm do it in secret and don't want other people to know that they are self-harming. Many of them cover it up and try to hide it. But even for the ones where it is a bit of a cry for help, let's think about this not as attention seeking, but attention needing. These are young people who are not getting the support that they need, and their way of expressing that is partly through self-harm. So I feel really strongly that sort of focusing in on that narrative of attention seeking is just not helpful to our young people. Let's instead think about why do they need attention. The next myth that I want to focus on is one that talks about self-harm being mostly something that girls do, and it's mostly something that affects kind of teenagers in secondary school. Once again, that's not a helpful myth, and especially as you, my audience today, are primary school staff, I want to be really clear that very sadly, there are trends around self-harm that tell us that it's something which is increasing in boys. It's increasing across all children and young people. And moreover, the age at which children are starting to self-harm is getting younger and younger. And having worked in many of the lovely primary schools this year, I can tell you that there are young people in primary school age whose distress has been such that they have resorted to harming themselves as a way to cope. Not that they necessarily realise and wouldn't necessarily be making that link between their distress and the behaviour, but when we spot that a young person has been harming themselves physically in some way, we definitely want to be thinking about what's going on for them, what distress is there in their lives that's causing them to self-harm. And I would definitely implore you in the primary schools to take away from your training today, even if you haven't come across it personally yet in primary schools, it is happening. Next up, another myth that I'd like to kind of talk about is the one that self-harm is always an attempt to die, an attempt at suicide, or is a marker of some kind of severe mental illness. That isn't true. There definitely is a correlation between self-harming behaviour and suicide, and we need to be on the lookout for young people who are both self-harming, but then when asked tell us that actually they were hoping to die as a result of what they did. However, and particularly at primary school age, it's not automatic that because a young person is self-harming, that's what they were aiming to do. So we need to be asking them really transparently and openly about what is going on for them. And it's okay to ask about suicide. Sometimes we think if we talk about suicide, it's going to make it likely that it happens. But research tells us time and again that that just is not the case. It is the case that when we talk about self-harm and suicide openly with young people, odds are that's going to put us in a much better position to support them. So asking them what they were hoping for or what was the reason for the self-harm can really help us to understand whether it was an attempt to die or actually a way to cope, or maybe the young person just isn't aware themselves consciously of quite what was going on for them at the time that they engaged in the self-harm. The next one is that it's a fashion or a trend. Again, that's quite dangerous talk. Again, we're sort of thinking that it's a deliberate attempt perhaps to be, following a trend, and that isn't the case. Yes, it's on the increase. Yes, young people have far more access now to internet websites and forums that glamorise the practice of self-harm. But that doesn't mean that that's why our young people are self-harming. And we need to be really clear that their reasons for doing it are often largely associated with psychological distress, and asking them and talking to them about that rather than thinking, oh, they're doing it for attention, or they're doing it to be, on trend, or they're doing it because all the other kids are. That's not a helpful total explanation of what's going on. So again, asking those questions to find out. Another myth that we often see is the only form is cutting. Well, you're going to see a bit later that there are many forms that self-harm takes. I think often if we were to Google an image of self-harm, that's the one that would come up, a young person with a sharp object, perhaps cutting their arms. And that definitely is a form that self-harm can take. But you will see later on that there are many different forms that it does take. I hope it goes without saying from everything that I've said so far that we do not believe that self-harm is a child or a young person's problem. I mean, actually, it is often related to a child or young person's problems, but a child or a young person is part of a family, they're part of a school, they're part of a nation, they're part of all sorts of systems. And to just park the problem with the child and not think about how those systems around them might be impacting them. Are there family problems? Are they struggling at school? We need to be thinking about what are these problems and how can we help them, rather than just leaving it with a child and blaming them for the behaviour. And finally, the severity of the act tells us something about the level of distress. I'm afraid that just isn't true. Looking at it one way, a young person who engages in really quite severe and dangerous self-harm that maybe needs a trip to A&E or needs even a hospital admission doesn't necessarily mean that they're far more distressed than another young person who has only been, harming themselves quite superficially, it's not too bad, the bruising's not too bad, or the cuts aren't too bad. Actually, all of those acts of self-harm are potentially a cry for distress, and we as staff need to get alongside that young person and understand what might be going on for them. So we're going to move on next to the whys and the hows of self-harm. This is, why do our young people self-harm, and how are they engaging in it? What are they doing to harm themselves? And this section comes with a slight health warning, because obviously I'm going to be talking about quite a distressing topic, thinking about our young children that are harming themselves in that way. And this may well catch a bit of a nerve for some of you who've perhaps been dealing with that either personally or professionally. Having said that, I'm not going to go into any gory detail. I'm not going to be showing any images, but I will just be talking around the topic of ways in which that can take place. So there are lots of possible reasons, as I've kind of already alluded to, around why people might be engaging in self-harm. One of the things that we see with some of our children who are either have a diagnosis of autistic spectrum disorder, or just our children that need a lot more sensory feedback and sensory input. Sometimes the behaviour that looks like self-harm actually isn't self-harm as a marker of psychological distress necessarily, but literally they just need that sensory input. And then we'd be thinking with them about how they can get that sensory feedback in ways that aren't actually giving them bruises or cuts, they're not banging their heads and so on. For other young people, engaging in self-harm, it can be a form of self-punishment. So these are the children that are experiencing feelings of perhaps guilt or self-disgust, and engaging in self-harm is a way to express their kind of anger with themselves for whatever it is that they feel that they've been doing wrong. And a really open conversation with a young person about that will help us to help them to let go of those feelings of guilt and self-disgust and come to terms with whatever it is that's been happening in their lives. Very, very often, though, we see self-harm as a kind of relief or respite from painful emotions. It's very often a way to cope, and I've put that in capital letters because it's not a way to die, but a way to live, a way for a young person to survive the difficulties that they are experiencing. Sometimes the child may not feel that they are being listened to, and so it is a way to let others know that they're not okay and they need to be talked to about that and listened to. Perhaps family aren't listening all that well, family's got other stuff going on, perhaps school are not noticing the distress that they're experiencing while they're at school, and sometimes we just need to have those conversations to understand how we can listen to them better and make them feel listened to and understood. Big scary emotions, especially in little people, can be really, really distressing, and sharing those and being listened to about them is just so powerful. There are various common triggers that we know statistically can often be behind self-harm. So things like bullying is a really big one, experiencing a single or multiple traumas, if there's abuse going on, school pressures, family distress, relationship difficulties, discrimination, all of those have been linked to self-harming behaviour where the young person is going through that stuff. It's really horrible for them, and that's their way of maybe feeling a little bit more in control or expressing the distress that they're feeling. Sometimes there just is no trigger. We can go looking for it, and it's absolutely okay to go looking for it and ask these questions quite openly about things like bullying or trauma. But sometimes there is no trigger at all, and it's more about the young person just going through a period of really low self-esteem and feeling completely powerless and out of control in their particular situation. So know that there are triggers, but also be aware that sometimes there isn't one particular trigger that we can locate or the child can put their finger on. Sometimes young people tell us that it's a need to feel more real. They are perhaps feeling quite scarily disconnected from themselves, and feeling physical pain can be a way to feel, oh no, okay, I am there, I am real. It's a really scary sensation, especially for littler people, if they are feeling quite unreal and feeling numb. And self-harm can be a way to feel less numb and more real. But obviously, it's not a good thing, and we need to help them to express that that's what they're feeling, connect with that feeling, and then think about with them ways that they could be feeling less numb and more real. And there are ways to do that that don't involve them actually hurting themselves. The cycle of self-harm helps us better understand why or how self-harm can be a bit of a self-reinforcing behaviour. So what we see is that young people are feeling, quite distressed, perhaps a bit disconnected, and they harm and they feel relieved. It brings a temporary relief, and that is extremely rewarding because it's a way temporarily to cope with the distress. But what we know is that quite soon after that initial relief, feelings of shame, guilt, remorse, self-disgust can be kicking in for them, and actually then they start to feel at least as bad as they were feeling before they harmed, and often they are feeling worse still. And the anxiety and the anger, maybe the self-hatred, the feeling of alienation can then start to mount. And what we know then is that it can feel like a lot of stuff going on all at once for them. It can cause them to panic, to dissociate, and then the way to cope with that is to go back to the self-harm because they know from their past that that has brought some relief. Goodness me, what a lot to go through, but don't worry because there are ways in which we can talk to them about that cycle, help them to understand it, and help them to find exit points from it so that the relief that they feel is real but isn't through harming themselves. In terms of the how, I said I wasn't going to be too graphic about this, but beyond cutting and scratching with sharp objects, there are lots of other ways that young people may be harming themselves. Burning, hitting, biting, banging and bruising themselves, pulling out their hair. We do see that actually, including in primary school. Sometimes they're pulling out their eyebrows or even their eyelashes really painfully as a way to cope with the distress that they're feeling. We hear and see of young people inserting objects into their body and taking overdoses of medication. Thankfully, that one, the medication one, doesn't tend to be something that we see too much in our younger children yet, thankfully at the moment. But obviously if that happens, we would be very much talking to the family about hiding medication away and keeping it safely under lock and key. Fortunately, children at primary school age are not able to walk into a Boots and buy paracetamol. But yeah, we would generally be thinking with families about keeping medication safe and locked away if we know that their young person is engaging in self-harm, and particularly if they've been accessing some of these websites that unhelpfully give young children more ideas of ways to harm themselves. A lot of what we see though in primary school is the biting, punching, scratching, slapping types of behaviour. And we've also seen the eyelash and eyebrow plucking behaviours this year. So those are ones to be looking out for, and they tend to be quite visible. So let's all be just on our guard, spotting and encouraging parents to be on their guard to spot signs of bruises and scratching that aren't just every day falling over in the playground, and thinking what might be behind that.
Hi, my name's Lauren and I'm the assistant psychologist working with Liz on this project. I'm going to be going through some warning signs of self-harm that you might be aware of already, but some you might not be. And we're also going to be talking about how to start that conversation with the young person and how to make them comfortable enough to talk to you about it. So in terms of warning signs, we've got some behavioural ones, some emotional ones and some physical ones. Sometimes you'll notice them already. Sometimes you will have to read between the lines a little bit at maybe some signals the young person's throwing out to you. But they can be quite difficult to spot in children of this age. Behaviourally, there's always the chance that the young person might actually disclose to you that they're hurting themselves, or maybe that they're experiencing big feelings that they don't quite understand or they don't know what to do with. This is not always the case though. And sometimes you might notice that they've withdrawn from previous activities, maybe some activities with their friends, or maybe they enjoyed football and they're not playing that anymore. They may be hiding some damage that they're causing to their bodies. For example, in PE, they might not want anyone to see them when they're changing. Little signs like that might mean something big. You might also notice that they're increased secrecy in terms of not wanting anybody to know what's going on. They don't want to tell anyone. They might be ashamed, or you might notice that they're a lot more lethargic and tired than they were before. Now, Liz has already alluded to self-harm often occurs in a dissociative state, but in times when they're alone as well. And often this is in the evenings when they might then be harming themselves instead of actually getting to sleep. Emotionally, you might notice that the young person is expressing wishes to punish themselves, and they may be showing a lack of or reduced care for how they look physically. They might not be looking after themselves emotionally anymore either, and their personal hygiene might also become quite poor. You might notice extreme mood swings and maybe emotional reactions that don't seem appropriate to a situation. So, for example, if there's been a minor change or a minor inconvenience and the young person explodes into a meltdown, that might be a sign that something a bit deeper is going on. Physically, you might notice the injuries the young person is giving themselves, but again, this is not always the case. As Liz has already said, it's important to remember that self-harm, although it is common in forms of cutting, there's other forms as well, like bruising, hair pulling, that if you're not looking for it and you're not aware of it, you might not notice. Another physical sign might be that the child's inappropriately dressed for the weather. So, for example, wearing long sleeves and tracksuit bottoms in the warm weather. They might be doing this in an attempt to hide their injuries because they might be feeling ashamed for what they've done to themselves. So what next? You've noticed these warning signs, but now what do? You do need to start thinking about having that conversation, but you speak to other staff members about it. You don't have to go into it alone, but this is what we're going to be talking about next. The reaction a young person receives when they've disclosed self-harm really does make such a big impact on whether they go on to actually stop this behaviour and take on some more healthy approaches. So when you're speaking to them, stay calm, be direct, and don't give them any judgment. So show that you're aware that what they're going through is really difficult and that these big feelings that they're having, you're there to support them through it. When you ask them questions and you want some more information, it's perfectly okay to ask them, but make sure you're asking open questions. You're not limiting their responses. You're not giving them questions where the only answer is a yes or no, or you also don't want to be leading them down to a certain answer. We say this because it's so important that you get the whole truth, because without that, you're not really going to know the best ways to help them or the best alternative strategies to be suggesting or working through with them. Again, do not rush them. It might be a 5-minute conversation, it might be a 50-minute conversation, but let them take it at their own pace. It may also be quite useful to have discussions as a wider school approach as well. So, for example, opening up emotional conversations in the classroom, encouraging children to talk to each other about how they feel. Encourage them each day to just say, oh, hi, I'm feeling this way today because, and it will encourage those open conversations that doesn't just target the one person that you're concerned about, but encourages a more open discussion in the whole school and reduces that stigma that does surround self-harm. So you can see on this slide that I've got a few possible responses, and I'll give you just a few minutes to read through the speech bubbles. You'll also notice there's a few things in italics, and I've popped this in here because they won't be relevant to each child, but you can use your judgment to just make some changes to suit whoever you're speaking to. Firstly, it's so important that you're completely transparent about confidentiality throughout. So even if they don't want to discuss the situation with you right now, you need to make them aware that you are going to have to speak to a DSL about what's going on and other relevant staff members, and their parents will also need to be informed. But when you're doing this, just stay calm, be completely honest, and involve them where they want to be involved, and just make sure all the time that they're as comfortable as they possibly could be. And here is where it's great to remind them that they've been so brave and thank them and praise them for the fact that they've actually opened up to you, because it's quite a scary situation for them to be in and it takes a lot for them to tell you. A lot of the time people can be worried about saying the wrong thing to a young person and making the problem worse, but there are ways you can do this and actually show your support and help them. But first, really, you need to get their full attention, because if they're not listening to you, you're not really going to get a message through, and they might be a bit more ashamed than they actually started out with. So one way to do this is to sit there and gently say their name if they seem a bit dozed or looking into the sky, seeing like daydreaming. Say their name gently and wait for a nod or some eye contact, or you'll know the child better than we do at this point. So whatever you know is their way of telling you that they're listening, wait for that signal before you start the conversation. Acknowledging their emotions and showing that you have the knowledge and you understand the situation they're in can increase their comfort further. So saying that you are worried because of X, Y, or Z, it shows them and understands why you've actually pulled them aside to have this conversation. Because if you can imagine they've been pulled aside by a teacher or a staff member, you may not be their favourite staff member or the person they would go to, but they need to understand why they've been pulled aside and they're having that discussion with you. It will help them to get all the truth out and to trust you and confide in you. Some clinicians would argue that for younger primary school children, the way you respond behaviourally could actually be more important than how you've responded verbally and what you've said to them. So first and foremost, don't panic. Hearing a disclosure like this or starting a conversation is very daunting, but you do have the knowledge, and we are helping you here with the knowledge on how to have this conversation with them. This will help them be confident in their ability to confide in you. And if you make the area comfortable, go to where you know they feel safe, this will help even more. When you're having the discussion, make sure you're taking the young person seriously. Even if what they're saying might seem minor to you, it might be the most major thing that's ever happened to them. And their big feelings can be quite scary, and you have to remember how small they are. And this might be the first time they've ever felt a certain way. And even though you felt this way before and you might have been fine, they might not be. It's different for everyone. Also, if the young person shows you any fresh injuries or you've seen any injuries, it's such a good idea at this point to provide any first aid that might be required. It will teach the young person that looking after their body is important, even if they're damaging it. Do this in a calm way without fuss, and obviously don't bring too much attention to them. And as well as looking after them, look after yourself, because again, this shows to the child that looking after your body and yourself and your mind is so important. But don't hide the fact that you might need to seek some support from another staff member to help them, because again, this opens up such a comfortable environment for them to speak in. But another important thing that you do need to do is just figure out if this is actually an emergency. If they've got injuries that are quite bad and might need stitches or medical attention, call an ambulance or take them to A&E. And as well, if they're expressing suicidal thoughts or suicidal ideation, again, you will need to take them to A&E or call 999. For children of a primary school age, it can actually be very effective to facilitate establishing strong peer relationships throughout the school. Instead of just focusing on that one child, it's really useful to focus on the environment as a whole. Encouraging this can boost well-being generally, not just for that child, but other students and staff members too. And it increases staff members' awareness of how each child is feeling, and it's easier then to notice any changes or any signals they might be throwing out to you. Coping strategies. Now, a child that's this young might need help in coming up with different coping strategies and might not know that what they're doing is actually harmful. For us to suggest specific ones now would probably not be the most helpful thing, because it really depends on the cause of the self-harm and the need that they're fulfilling by doing it. That would change which coping strategies they use and when they use them. But we do have a self-harm distraction techniques booklet that will be going out with this training, and in that you can find different strategies that will help the person dependent on their need. So for example, it might be wise to suggest a soft pillow or a stuffed animal that they can use to hit or scream into and get their anger out. Some other children, it might be wise to use an elastic band on their wrist or on their skin so that they're not hurting themselves, but they're still having some feelings. Among the advice of what you should do, there's also things that you probably should not be doing. Now, firstly, avoid showing excessive emotion when you respond. So responding with frustration, getting upset yourself, responding with anger, it's likely to push the child into a corner and make them feel more scared about what they're doing than they probably already are. Now, if you do feel this way, that's okay and it's normal and it's a scary situation to be in for you, but you can go and get another staff member, seek some support yourself, and there's nothing to be ashamed of if you need to do that. When you're talking to them, don't force them into a corner and don't demand that they just stop. Have open conversations and find that need of the harm, because turning around and saying, don't do this or stop this or I'll do this, it's not going to help them, and these ultimatums are going to stop them from speaking out in the future. In an initial conversation, it is vital not to promise confidentiality. In order to protect the child and yourself, in a situation like this, confidentiality has to be broken. But breaking any promises you've made can completely break that trust in you. But they might also then see you as a representative for other adults, and then they might not trust anybody else as well. But having that conversation with them and explaining the situation and why you need to get another adult involved, they're likely to then understand and accept your reasons, even if they're upset by it. It's also a good idea, if they're comfortable, to involve them in any further discussions that you're having. They can then be involved, and they might even then be able to express their feelings in their own words, just like they have done to you. When you're discussing the topic with them, do not brush off anything they say. Even if it seems minor to you, it might not be to them. And don't compare them to other individuals who might have it worse or who might be using different methods to harm, as this is likely to discourage the individual and make them feel even more alone and alienated. Your involvement is also quite unlikely to stop straight after the initial disclosure or your initial starting of the conversation. Stay aware of any other warning signs that may start, and check in with the child regularly. Ask them how they're doing, how they're feeling, or what they've been up to recently. You don't always have to start a conversation about the harming, but starting any conversation with them and showing that you care and you're interested in their life can really help them in the future. But when you're looking out for other warning signs, be aware of how severe these might be. It might be that they need more intensive intervention, and in a serious scenario, might be giving you warning signs that their life could be at risk. But by avoiding these response styles that we've mentioned on the screen here, you're likely to be able to create a more calm and accepting environment for them, where they feel safe and they can talk to you about how they feel and what they're experiencing.
So we're reaching the end of this training session today, and I thought it might be helpful just to pull out a few final thoughts, because there's been a lot of content for you to take in. And I think the thing that I would most like you to take away from this training is the first bullet on this slide, which is to listen without judgment. Try to stay calm, keep your own emotions in check, and really show the child that you are listening to them and not judging them. As a school, we believe in psychology that it's a really good thing for schools to sit down and think together, what is the whole school approach that we're going to take to this topic? Is there a stigma about this topic among us, the staff, within the school culture, for the kids? How can we think about ways in which we might start to tackle that stigma? We also strongly recommend that staff think about what the ground rules should be, both for staff when they are handling these kinds of issues in school, but also among the children. For example, among the children, we would want to be thinking about how we make it really clear to them that showing off wounds and talking about this kind of stuff to other kids is not a behaviour that we can encourage, and we would want to be talking to children about that and making sure that it doesn't happen. I think it's great, and we know that in the Trust we strongly feel that resilience is a really important part of how we are raising this generation of children, and teaching children resilience skills with the everyday challenges, the moments when they get stuck on something in class and can't get it. How do we teach them to handle that situation, not by beating themselves up either emotionally or actually physically, but finding ways to go, okay, I can't do this at the moment. What do I need to do to get better at this? A really simple example, but teaching resilience will go a long way to ensuring that when the bigger stuff happens in these children's lives, they've got ways to cope and to deal with it that doesn't involve resorting to self-harm. Finally, I think it's really important to raise that staff need to look after each other with this difficult topic. If anything has been raised today whereby you need to talk to somebody, your DSLs will make themselves available to talk through things that might have felt quite difficult as you listen to this training. And you definitely would want to be involving your DSL in situations like this. And also give support to one another if a member of staff is handling a situation. It is emotionally taxing stuff, so be there for each other. And if you need to seek further support, there are staff systems in place so that you can access the support that you need. So do talk to either your line manager or somebody in HR about how to access those. There's been an awful lot of stuff talked about today, and we are very aware that we possibly have raised some questions in your minds as well. And for that reason, during September, we will be running 2 live Q&A sessions. There'll be a panel of staff, so DSL people and members of the psychology team, online on a Teams call, ready to answer any questions that this might have raised for you today. So hopefully, if you would like a bit more meat on the bone around this topic, then you will be able to dial into one of those. We will make them at different times and days with the hope that as many staff as possible are able to access those if they'd like to. But secondly, if you can't attend either of those for whatever reason, we are encouraging people to send in questions in advance of the live Q&A so that we can tackle the questions that you've got as you've watched this training. So do send those in to psychology.team, the psychology address on the THPT email address system. And we will look forward to seeing many of you in September for that live Q&A session. I hope this has been helpful.